This video is made possible by Brilliant. You'll learn more about Brilliant later in today's video, but if you'd like to learn more about them right now, you can go to brilliant.org/biographics. You'll also find a link in the description below. My Japanese pronunciation, though, is not brilliant, so bear with me in this video. I have a computer here. I'm looking up the stuff when I can. Sometimes I fail. If you want to have a go at me in the comments, go right ahead. During World War II and the Second Sino-Japanese War, a doctor named Shiro Ishii was responsible for creating biological weapons of mass destruction. Ishii built a laboratory in Manchuria called Unit 731 on behalf of the Japanese government. Its goal was to create a weapon so deadly it could wipe out the population of Japan's enemies. He used nearby Chinese villagers as his human guinea pigs for these biological weapons and experimented on men, women, and even children. When the war was over, the United States learned about Shiro Ishii's sadistic experiments. While many of the Nazis were sentenced to death for their crimes against humanity in Europe's concentration camps, Shiro Ishii was allowed to go free. So, what would drive someone to become one of the most evil men in history? And why on earth was he allowed to get away with mass murder? Well, that's what we're looking at in this week's Biographics. Shiro Ishii was born in 1892 in a village called Shibayama in the Chiba prefecture of Japan. His parents were wealthy landowners that came from a long line of daimyo, or feudal lords, who owned the most land in any given area. The Japanese system of prefectures, or states, had only just begun in the 1870s, so his parents were very powerful and still had a lot of control over the government in the Chiba prefecture. Throughout history, these wealthy landowners benefited from indentured servants who farmed the fields, and they were able to enjoy a lavish lifestyle. Even into the 19th century, these descendants of the daimyo were still very much benefiting from their family's fortunes. At the same time, the Japanese people looked up to the Emperor of Japan with a godlike admiration. Even though they logically knew the imperial family were mortals, they still had a very strong sense of loyalty, and they believed that the life of someone living in the lower class was truly not as valuable as someone from the upper class. Because of this Japanese mindset, Shiro Ishii was raised to believe that he truly was far more important than most people. Not much else is known about his younger years, except to say that it would seem like his path seems very linear. It is almost as if all of his life experiences were preparing him to experiment on human beings without any sense of remorse. Shiro Ishii studied medicine at Kyoto Imperial University, but he wasn't interested in becoming a doctor who healed the common people in a hospital. He became a surgeon for the Imperial Japanese Army in 1921 and earned the rank of lieutenant. His superiors were impressed with his surgical skills, so they sent him to the Army Medical School in Tokyo for further training. They also paid for him to study in a postgraduate medicine program at Kyoto Imperial University. Even though he did become a medical doctor, like we said, he wasn't interested in healing patients. He was far more fascinated with studying and experimentation. He had a particular love of biology, and particularly bacteria. He used to grow deadly bacteria in petri dishes, and he called them his pets. In the early 1920s, he finished his many years of medical school and went on a 2-year trip around the world to visit 30 countries. He was particularly fascinated with staying in Germany so that he could study the poison gases that their army used during World War I. Chlorine gas had been used as a weapon of war, but both sides began to use gas masks. As far as Shiro Ishii was concerned, gas was no longer an effective means of killing another soldier. In 1931, the Chinese territory of Manchuria was taken over by Japan during the Second Sino-Japanese War. This was a huge victory for Japan, and they were already occupying Korea. They were feeling very confident that they could spread this empire to conquer the entire rest of China. Shiro Ishii saw this new Manchurian territory as a perfect opportunity for him to take his theoretical ideas of biological weapons and make them into a devastating reality. Just like an evil villain in a Bond movie, he was searching for a plague that was capable of wiping out the entire human race, or at least the enemies of the Japanese Empire. At this point, Shiro Ishii had such a powerful position in the military and government that he was able to personally approach the emperor and request the funding to create a laboratory in Manchuria. After that permission was granted, he built a massive compound called Unit 731. It was officially called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Supply Unit because its true purpose of studying biological weapons was supposed to remain a secret. They were given a huge budget which they spent on state-of-the-art equipment. Unit 731 was similar to a Nazi concentration camp in that it was an entire campus of buildings which included holding cells, medical facilities, and a gigantic crematorium. The administration building where Ishii worked was so strong it was the last building left standing after being bombed years later. But, of course, you can't have human experimentation without test subjects. The Japanese Kenpeitai military police would grab Chinese people off the streets of their villages and arrest them. They were put on trains that arrived at Unit 731 and they were never allowed to see their families again. They captured all ages of men, women, and even young children because they wanted to see how these weapons affected all types of people. According to the military doctors who worked there, they were forced to work at Unit 731 without really even knowing what they were getting themselves into. Upon arrival, they would find doctors injecting Chinese people with a deadly disease like anthrax or the bubonic plague. If they spoke out against the experiments, it would be treason, and they could be executed for it. For those who were forced to work in Unit 731, they had to believe that this was all just a part of war, and killing these civilians was no different than bombing an enemy country. In fact, they believed that their actions were far more noble than the average soldier because they killed in the name of science. Doctors would dissect human beings while they were still alive without using any anesthetic. They wanted to see what organs looked like while they were still functioning and to learn exactly how the disease would cause these organs to fail. Some other subjects were given a vaccine to the plague first before exposing them to the disease. This way, they were able to know exactly what the strongest vaccines were for the deadliest diseases in the world. Once they perfected the formula, they were able to create enough antidotes for all of Japan. In this way, Unit 731 was making breakthroughs in modern medicine, but it was at the expense of a great many Chinese lives. Their holding cells, they were large enough that they could hold up to 600 people at a time. They called these people Maritas, which means logs, which only further dehumanized them. The average lifespan for these prisoners was only 4 to 6 weeks. When their bodies were done being used, they were thrown in a pile and burned in the crematorium. In his laboratory, Shiro Ishii was experimenting with the bubonic plague, which is known for being one of the most deadly diseases in history. But he didn't want it to be the same plague that we remember from the past. He genetically altered it to be extremely potent and far more capable of killing people than any previous strain of the plague. The bubonic plague can only be transferred through blood, so he wanted to release disease-ridden fleas on unsuspecting villagers in order to test how strong it truly was. They collected rats, which were perfect incubators for thousands upon thousands of fleas. Then the insects were carefully gathered and put into containers. Their first round of experiments had airplanes dropping baskets full of fleas into Chinese villages of civilians, and it worked exactly as they had hoped. Between 1939 and 1942, plagues began to spread in these villages. 1/3 of the total population of each village was wiped out. These manufactured plagues were so potent that once they were infected, people would just die within 1 to 2 days. According to testimony by a man named Jing Fu, his sister was infected with this megaplague. After being bitten by one of the fleas, the gland in her neck was so swollen it was as large as her head. She knew that if she stayed inside and received medical treatment, she would infect the rest of her family with the plague, so she had to go into the middle of a field and die alone. Their family members could not get near her, and they had no choice but to burn her body in the field where she lay. While baskets full of fleas may have worked with low-flying planes, Shiro Ishii knew that if he wanted to infect enemy countries, they would need to drop actual bombs filled with fleas. The only issue was that the fleas would, of course, die in the explosion. He figured out that by creating clay pot containers, he could drop a so-called germ bomb that would smash when it hit the ground, and the fleas would stay alive. But they didn't just stop at the bubonic plague. They experimented with anthrax and typhoid as well. After dropping these bombs on even more Chinese villages, the Japanese soldiers showed up in all-white lab suits covering their entire body. They would command villagers to come out of their homes, and they would find subjects who had been infected by the plague and perform dissections in the middle of a field while their friends and family watched on. To Shiro Ishii, it was all about gathering data and statistics. These people, they were just numbers on a page. They were not actual human lives to him. The Kempeitai were even given candy from Unit 731 and instructed to show up to villagers and hand out the sweets to small children. While Chinese villagers interpreted this as an act of kindness, the candy was actually laced with anthrax. The scientists would later arrive and observe parents beginning to panic as their children died in their arms. As time went on, the unit expanded their human experiments beyond diseases. They also did experiments on frostbite and the effects of shrapnel wounds. This involved strapping people down to a wooden plank before blowing up a bomb next to them. All of this was just so they could study how a human would be blown apart by different types of weapons. So I think now is probably a good time for a little breather. This one's a bit intense. I mean, science. It's responsible for the devastation of lives as we're seeing in this video, but it's also responsible for the saving of millions. Used the right way, science changes the world in remarkable ways for the better, and that's why I'm pleased in this video to tell you about Brilliant. And I know, as always, these ads in the middle, they're less than awesome, but Brilliant are fantastic for sponsoring this sort of longer content because it allows us to share the darker lessons from scientific history in a thoughtful way. Brilliant are a science learning platform that allow you to learn through active learning, which summed up is basically the opposite of that feeling of reading a complex paragraph about some principle and then just having absolutely no clue what on earth it was going on about, even on the 10th read through. And they don't just cover the basics, although they do cover those as well, but it goes through to really complex things like advanced statistics. I was recently going through a course on statistics, particularly the one Lying with Statistics. It's an amazing primer on how to be aware of when the media is misusing statistics to push your opinion one way or the other. Brilliant makes even complex statistical concepts easy to understand. They give you something super short to read, it's very easy, and then you immediately apply it to a problem. And then you just rinse and repeat that, and all of a sudden you're understanding things that you never thought you would be. I've been using Brilliant for a while. You should just give it a go to see how easy it is to start understanding complex subjects. So support Biographics by going to brilliant.org/biographics. And now, let's get back to abusing science. Even though Shiro Ishii and Unit 731 had developed these deadly weapons, they never made this public knowledge or threatened to use the germ bombs. Some historians believe that if the Americans knew about these bioweapons ahead of time, they would have never dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki for fear of mutual destruction. But if you think the Allied powers were safe from the sadistic experiments going on in Manchuria, well, think again. Shiro Ishii plans a long-distance attack on the United States called Mission Cherry Blossoms at Night. They attempted to launch balloons that were filled with deadly diseases like cholera, smallpox, and the bubonic plague, as well as anthrax and botulism. An estimated 9,000 balloons were sent across the Pacific Ocean, but only 345 of them actually made it to the United States. Many of them were shot down and some landed in the ocean or in forests or fields. Considering there were a lot of UFO sightings at the time, it might be possible that some people were seeing these germ balloons and mistaking them for something else. There was actually only one of these that caused any casualties. It landed in a town called Bly, Oregon on May the 5th, 1945. A Sunday school teacher named Elsie Mitchell was on a day trip going on a picnic in the mountains with a small group of her teenage students. Her husband Archie, who was also their minister, was driving the car up the mountain. Elsie was a few months pregnant and she got sick during the car ride. Her husband pulled over to let her out to get some air. They had parked near a crew of men who were doing construction work on the road. The students and Elsie decided to take a short walk through the woods, and Archie began to speak with the men. He then heard his wife's voice say, "Look what I found, dear," followed by an explosion. Elsie had come across one of the balloons. She had no idea that it was actually a bomb, and approaching it, she triggered the explosion. Archie and the crew ran towards the sounds, and they found the bodies of Elsie and a group of students lying dead on the ground. While most Americans were kept safe from Shiro Ishii's experiments, those who were stationed in Asia during World War II, well, they weren't so lucky. In 1944 and 1945, American prisoners of war were in a city called Mudcon. They were visited by Japanese doctors. Many of them had already been in captivity for several years at this point. The Japanese wanted to see if their results were any different on different races. They injected the men with various deadly diseases and repeated the exact experiments that they'd done on the Chinese. Many of these men died, and the ones who survived were only kept around so they could carry away the bodies of their friends. When World War II was over, the Allied forces won, and they took away power from Emperor Hirohito. In Manchuria, China had defeated the Japanese as well. There was nowhere left for Shiro Ishii to hide. Nazi war criminals, they were being brought to trial in Nuremberg in 1945 and 1946, and many of them were being sentenced to death for their crimes against humanity. The Japanese military still awarded Shiro Ishii with medals of honor and a healthy pension for his retirement. In their eyes, he was a hero for the country, but he knew that America would not feel the same, especially once they heard the stories from the POWs. Shiro Ishii commanded his doctors and soldiers to never speak of the experiments that went on in Unit 731. But, of course, they learned about the experiments through the American soldiers who survived. The American government approached Ishii, but instead of arresting him, they asked to make a deal. They wanted his data in exchange for immunity. Shiro Ishii knew that this was the only way he could save himself. He promised that if they pardoned all of his crimes, the US government could benefit from having all of the scientific information that they had gathered from their experiments. In the United States, there are ethical laws in place so that American scientists are never allowed to experiment on human beings. By law, they can only experiment on animals. For this reason, the government knew that these experiments were truly valuable because it was information that they would never be able to receive on their own. It's one thing to inject a rat or a rabbit with a disease, but it's a totally different thing to actually know the results on human beings. And more importantly, the Americans would gain access to the vaccines that Shiro Ishii developed for some of the deadliest diseases known to mankind. They agreed to trade his data in exchange for his life, and they even paid him $250,000. And in modern money, that's about $2.6 million. All of the scientists and soldiers who were involved with Unit 731 were happy to keep the secret because they were deeply ashamed of their participation with the project. Some of them even felt too ashamed to return to Japan because they were afraid that people would learn about their crimes. A few of them even tried to live in China under new identities. The New York Times tried to expose this by publishing an article about his human experiments in 1946, but beyond that, the events gained very little media attention. Since all of these atrocities happened in Manchuria, they were technically a part of the Second Sino-Japanese War and not World War II, even though both wars were happening simultaneously. For Americans, it was overshadowed by the thousands of testimonies coming out of Europe about the Holocaust. But, of course, the Chinese people, they've not forgotten. Even to this day, many Chinese people still hate the Japanese for what happened during this war. However, most Japanese civilians were unaware of Ishii's human experiments, and they consider themselves to be mostly victims of the war. After the nuclear bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese surrendered, and there was never the chance for them to start a massive global plague. So what about those POWs? In the 1940s, government officials approached them and demanded that they sign a non-disclosure contract. They promised never to expose the truth about what had happened to them in Manchuria. However, in the 1980s, many of those soldiers felt that they had nothing left to lose, and they came forward to testify that they had been a part of these human experiments. It wasn't until the 1990s that Japan officially acknowledged that Unit 731 was real, and it wasn't just a conspiracy theory. Shiro Ishii went on to live into old age, and he died at the age of 67. Even after the wars were over, the plagues that Shiro Ishii unleashed in China continued to spread and kill people for years to come. His exact number of victims is unknown. Some estimate that he was responsible for tens of thousands, while others say the number would be in the hundreds of thousands of people. So I really hope you found that video interesting. Just a reminder that you should check out Brilliant. You can find a link to them in the description below. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you liked it, and also give us a like. Why not? And thank you for watching.